There are days that pretend to be beautiful, days wrapped in music and blessings, yet beneath the surface they carry storms powerful enough to shatter an entire future. Amina did not know it that morning, but the celebration meant to honor her was already waiting to wound her in ways she never imagined. The sun rose softly over the village, its warm light washing the dusty paths and clay houses in a gentle glow that made the world look kinder than it truly was. For a moment, Amina allowed herself to believe that nothing could ruin the day she had dreamed of since childhood. Women from the neighborhood helped her dress, smoothing the embroidered fabric of her gown, placing delicate beads in her hair, and whispering blessings filled with hope and excitement. Her mother's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the final pleat, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of seeing her daughter step into a new chapter. Amina smiled at her reflection, noticing the glow that came not from vanity, but from a quiet belief that life might finally be turning in her favor. As the drums outside began to echo through the village, she stepped into the courtyard, where guests gathered in clusters of vibrant colors. Laughter tangled with the rhythm of melodies played by local musicians, and the scent of freshly prepared food drifted through the air as friends and relatives moved with the carefree energy of people celebrating love. Children ran beside her, tossing petals at her feet, announcing her arrival with innocent excitement. For a brief moment, Amina felt embraced by the warmth of community, held by the illusion that she was surrounded by nothing but goodwill. But there were eyes among the crowd that did not shine with joy, eyes that observed her with a coldness hidden beneath forced smiles, eyes that had always believed she was unworthy of the man she was about to marry. Her groom's family had agreed to the marriage, but their acceptance came burdened with hesitation, a hesitation born from pride and unspoken resentment. Amina sensed the shift in the air as she approached them, the subtle tightening of lips, the stiffening of shoulders, the faint change in tone that only a heart taught by hardship would recognize. Still, she continued forward with graceful composure, determined not to let doubt dim the meaning of her day. The groom's mother stood at the front, her expression unreadable as she examined every detail of Amina's attire. Guests grew quieter, leaning slightly closer, the celebratory atmosphere slowly bending under the weight of something more sinister. And then, in a sudden burst of accusation, the groom's mother spoke words sharp enough to silence the drums mid-beat. She questioned Amina's character, her upbringing, her worthiness, each sentence harsher than the last, each phrase cutting deeper into the spirit of a bride who had only walked forward with dreams in her heart. Gasps rippled through the crowd, like a wave, collapsing into itself. Those who moments earlier danced with joy now exchanged anxious glances, unsure whether to defend her or distance themselves from the unfolding humiliation. The groom, instead of offering protection or clarity, stepped back, as though embarrassed to be associated with her, leaving Amina exposed before the judgment of hundreds. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred, and her heart, once full of anticipation, began to fold under the weight of betrayal she never expected to face on the day meant to bless her. She attempted to speak, to steady herself, to hold on to the fragments of dignity slipping through her fingers, but each word dissolved before it could leave her lips. The whispers began first, quiet, sharp, merciless. They crawled through the gathering, turning strangers into critics and guests into witnesses of her shame. Even the music, once so full of life, seemed to disappear into the thickening silence. Amina felt her knees weaken, yet she stood as firmly as she could, refusing to let the world see the depth of her breaking. Her mother tried to reach her, but the crowd formed an invisible barrier, watching the scene with uncomfortable fascination. The humiliation was complete, not because of the accusations themselves, but because of how publicly and mercilessly they were delivered. And in that moment, surrounded by eyes that refused to look away, Amina understood that this day was no longer her celebration. It had transformed into a wound, carved deep into her soul. When the gathering finally dissolved and the groom's family announced that the wedding would not continue, Amina turned away slowly, each step heavier than the last. Her wedding gown, once a symbol of hope, now clung to her like a reminder of everything she had lost in a single afternoon. She walked back toward her home with a silence so deep it felt like a shadow following her, swallowing every trace of joy she had carried into the day. But as she stepped beyond the edge of the courtyard, unaware of the eyes quietly following her, she did not know that someone unexpected had witnessed the entire humiliation, and that person would later reshape her future in ways she could never imagine. Humiliation does not end when the crowd disperses. Sometimes it follows you like a shadow that refuses to fade, tightening its grip with every step you take away from the place where your heart was torn apart. Amina walked through the dusty village path with her wedding dress, dragging behind her like a burden she could not set down. The once beautiful fabric was now stained with dust, crushed petals, and memories she desperately wanted to escape. The air around her seemed heavier than before, as though the weight of hundreds of judging eyes still clung to her back. Each step deepened her exhaustion, yet she moved forward, because standing still felt even more unbearable. She had expected her wedding day to end with blessings, laughter, and a future she could claim, with pride. Instead, it ended with whispers carried by the wind, murmurs bent on carving her humiliation into the memory of every person who had witnessed the cruelty. Her home came into view, a modest compound built of sun-baked clay and thatching worn by time. Normally, the sight of it brought her comfort, a reminder of the place where she found warmth despite life's challenges. But today, even the familiar walls felt different, as though they too knew what had happened. A few neighbors lingered in front of their houses, pretending to sweep or tend fires, their eyes following Amina with a mixture of pity, curiosity, and quiet satisfaction. Some murmured among themselves, not even attempting to hide their interest. Others offered forced smiles that felt more like salt on her wound. Children who had earlier cheered for her as she walked toward the ceremony now stared with confusion, whispering questions their parents refused to answer aloud. Her mother rushed out when she heard footsteps, her breath catching at the sight of Amina still in her wedding gown. Her eyes glistened with a grief that could not be spoken, yet she gathered her daughter into her arms with a tenderness that tried desperately to protect her from the world's harshness. Amina did not cry. Her tears had dried somewhere between the courtyard and this doorstep. She simply clung to her mother, drawing strength from the older woman's trembling hands. Her father stood behind them, silent and stiff, the shame of the day settling heavily across his shoulders. He did not know whether to offer comfort or retreat into the quiet disappointment that gnawed at him. Inside the house, the silence felt thick enough to choke her. Relatives who had come to support the wedding now sat with uneasy expressions, their earlier excitement dissolved into awkward stillness. Some avoided her gaze entirely, as though looking at her might stain them with her misfortune. Others whispered in corners, their words wrapped in the same sharp judgment she had tried to escape. Amina sat on a low stool, staring at her hands, feeling the fabric of her dress prick her skin like a reminder she wanted to rip away. But she did not move. She feared that if she stood, the fragments of her dignity would scatter beyond repair. Her mother knelt beside her, gently removing the beads in her hair, with the kind of care reserved for someone fragile. Each bead that fell into her palm felt like another piece of the future slipping away. She spoke only in soft murmurs, trying to reassure Amina that life would not remain broken forever, but even her voice trembled with uncertainty. Amina listened without responding, her body exhausted, her spirit wounded, her mind replaying the accusations thrown at her earlier. They echoed in her memory with punishing clarity, mingling with the whispers that now filtered through the house like unwelcome visitors. As night settled, relatives left one by one, their footsteps fading into the dark while carrying the story of her public humiliation with them. Amina knew by morning the entire village would know what had happened. Shame travels faster than truth, and the cruelty of gossip always finds eager listeners. She felt trapped. Every direction she turned seemed to lead deeper into the echo of what the world now believed she was. Her siblings watched her with confusion and concern, too young to understand why their sister, who had left the house glowing with hope, now returned dimmed and shaken. Amina forced a small smile for them, but the effort pulled at something tender inside her. Later, she stepped outside to breathe, hoping the night air would soothe her heart. But even the silence felt unforgiving, as though it too had heard every whisper spoken about her. Her father finally approached her, his voice heavy with worry rather than blame. He told her that life sometimes breaks us in places where we expected to be blessed, but survival required movement, not stillness. Amina nodded, absorbing the words but unsure what to do with them. She felt unanchored, caught between shame and the faintest flicker of resilience. Just as the moon rose higher, casting silver light across their compound, a loud knock echoed at the gate, a knock that struck through the quiet, like a warning. Her mother froze, her father straightened, and Amina felt something unsettling rise within her chest. And just when she thought the day could not deepen its wound, the unexpected visitor at the gate brought news powerful enough to push her out of the only place she had ever called home. Sometimes, destiny waits in places we reach only after everything else falls apart, hidden in the corners of unfamiliar roads where broken hearts search for a way to breathe again. Amina left her village before sunrise, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag, a bruised spirit, and the unbearable weight of humiliation that clung to her like a second skin. The air was cold, and the ground still held the memory of night, but she walked with a determination sharpened by pain. Every step felt like a quiet rebellion against the voices that had suffocated her future. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she could no longer remain in a place where every whisper felt like an accusation, and every familiar face reminded her of the wedding that had dissolved before her eyes. The journey by bus was long and uncomfortable. She sat squeezed between strangers, her wedding dress tucked into her bag so it wouldn't be recognized, though she suspected people could still sense the heaviness in her silence. Outside the window, villages passed like fleeting memories, fields of maize shimmering under the early light, children herding goats along narrow paths, open markets awakening with chatter and dusty colors. Amina watched quietly, trying to lose herself in the landscape, hoping each mile would strip away a little more of the shame she carried. By the time she reached the Aiza city, the sun stood high and the heat clung to her skin in thick waves. The noise engulfed her, cars honking, vendors shouting, music pulsing from small shops. Everything moved fast. Everyone moved with purpose, and she felt strangely invisible in the chaos. But perhaps invisibility was what she needed. Here, no one knew her. No one pointed. No one whispered her name with pity. Relief mixed with fear as she realized she was alone in a world too big to understand her pain. Her stomach tightened with hunger, reminding her she had eaten nothing since the previous afternoon. She wandered through busy streets, searching for work, any work that would help her survive even one more day. She approached kiosks, small restaurants, roadside stalls, but each rejection chipped away at her hope. Some employers looked at her with suspicion, others with indifference. She tried not to let discouragement shape her steps, yet exhaustion pressed heavily on her. Late in the afternoon, as she reached a quieter street lined with tall office buildings and small cafes, her legs faltered. She paused near a bench, wiping sweat from her forehead, trying to steady her breath before continuing. It was then she noticed a man standing outside a modest technology shop, speaking calmly to an employee. He wore a dark shirt neatly tucked into tailored trousers, but his warmth came not from his clothes. It came from the quiet steadiness in his posture, the way he listened, the way he regarded the world with a thoughtful stillness, rare in a city filled with haste. When he looked up, his gaze met hers for a single moment, long enough for him to notice the exhaustion buried behind her eyes, the hurt trying not to collapse into despair, and the quiet dignity she carried even in brokenness. Malik did not stare with curiosity or judgment. He simply observed with the kind of attention that sees beyond the surface. Amina, too drained to think, quickly looked away and began walking again, convinced the moment meant nothing. But Malik watched her. Something about the girl with tired eyes and a determined stride tugged at him. Something unspoken, something familiar. He couldn't explain it, yet he found himself replaying the glimpse of her expression, the fragile strength in her steps, the way her silence seemed filled with a story he wished he knew. Amina found a cheap room to sleep in that night, but sleep refused to come easily. She stared at the ceiling, wondering if fate had anything left for her, besides struggle. The city felt cold, yet she sensed a strange pull inside her, a feeling she could not name, as if something in this foreign place waited for her. Meanwhile, Malik sat in his office long after his employees had left. The image of the girl lingered in his thoughts, stirring a concern he could not shake. He had seen pain before, in families his foundation supported, in communities broken by hardship. But the quiet resilience in her eyes was something rare. He wondered who she was, what burden she carried, and why her presence had unsettled him so deeply. Days passed before their paths crossed again, not through coincidence, but through revelation. Malik overheard a conversation between two villagers who had recently arrived in the city. They spoke of a wedding ruined by public humiliation, of a bride left standing alone, of a young woman forced to flee her home to escape the cruelty she did not deserve. The details matched too closely to the girl he had seen. As the truth settled over him, Malik felt something unexpected ignite within his chest. Not pity, but a fierce resolve. And in that moment, knowing what she had endured, he realized he could not let her disappear into the city's shadows, because her story had already begun to change something inside him. Life rarely offers a second chance without demanding courage in return, and when it does, it arrives wrapped not in comfort, but in the unsettling weight of choices that can reshape an entire future. When Malik finally approached Amina, he did so with the same calm steadiness that had struck her on the first day she saw him. Yet there was something firmer behind his eyes now, something shaped by the truth he had uncovered about her past. Amina had been wiping the counter of a small cafe, where she managed to get temporary work, her movements slow from exhaustion and the raw ache of adjusting to city life. The moment she looked up and saw him standing outside the door, dressed in a crisp shirt and carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to responsibility, her heartbeat trembled against her ribs. She wondered why someone like him would seek out someone like her, someone still trying to rebuild pieces that had not yet found their place. Malik didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke with a clarity softened by respect, telling her he had learned the truth about her wedding, how she had been humiliated without reason, how her dignity had been torn apart in front of strangers, and how she had disappeared quietly into a world that didn't know her name or her worth. His words were gentle, yet heavy with understanding, and Amina felt something stir inside her, a mixture of embarrassment, gratitude, and disbelief. She waited for pity, but none came. Instead, Malik spoke of recognizing strength where others had seen weakness, of seeing intelligence in her eyes when she thought she had only shown pain. Then he made the offer. A position at his company, with training, fair pay, and the possibility of building a life far from the judgment that had driven her away. The moment felt almost unreal. She stood frozen, gripping the cloth in her hand as if it anchored her to the ground. A job. From a man she had spoken to only briefly? The idea frightened her as much as it tempted her. She remembered how her confidence had been shattered, how every whisper in her village had taught her to shrink, to hide, to stop believing she could ever be enough. And now, Here was someone offering her a place in a world she had never imagined stepping into. A world that felt too polished, too demanding, too exposed for someone who had spent weeks merely trying to survive. Every fear she had carried since her wedding day rose up at once, filling her with doubts that clouded even the slightest hope. But survival has its own way of guiding the heart. She looked around the cafe, the peeling paint, the clatter of plates, the words of customers barely acknowledging her existence. She felt the ache in her back from long hours on her feet, the sting of knowing her skills were wasted on tasks that led nowhere. Malik's offer, daunting as it was, carried a possibility she could no longer ignore. After a long, trembling pause, she nodded and whispered her acceptance. Malik didn't smile triumphantly or act as though he had done her a favor. Instead, he simply told her she had made a brave choice, one that many would never have dared. Her first days at his company felt like stepping into another universe. The building buzzed with quiet professionalism, polished floors reflecting sunlight, employees moving with purpose through wide hallways decorated with photographs of successful projects. Amina felt small at first, overwhelmed by technology she didn't understand, and procedures that seemed far beyond her reach. Yet Malik had meant what he said. She was not thrown into expectations she could not handle. She began with simple administrative tasks, learning how to sort documents, organize schedules, and assist team members. Even these tasks challenged her, but each day she approached them with the quiet determination that had always lived beneath her pain. Her colleagues observed her cautiously at first. Some were polite, others indifferent, and a few carried the subtle arrogance of those who judged before knowing. Amina absorbed it all silently, her resilience rebuilding itself piece by piece. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she participated, and allowed herself to grow slowly into the unfamiliar environment. What surprised her most was how quickly she began to adapt. The rhythm of the office grew familiar, the weight of self-doubt slowly easing as she realized she could learn, she could keep up, and she could contribute. Malik paid attention without hovering. He offered guidance when she needed it, and space when she needed to prove something to herself. Each small success felt like a quiet victory, each challenge a reminder of how far she had come from the ruins of her wedding day. She breathed differently now, not with fear, but with the fragile beginnings of belief. Yet not everyone welcomed her presence. In the far corner of the office, someone else had begun watching her, studying her with an intensity she didn't yet sense, carrying intentions that did not resemble Malik's sincerity. And as her confidence slowly blossomed, she remained unaware that a pair of calculating eyes had already chosen her as the target of a storm she never saw coming. The wounds we try hardest to outrun rarely vanish. They return in new disguises, sharper and more deliberate, as if determined to test whether the healing we claim is real or merely a fragile illusion waiting to shatter. Amina had begun settling into her new rhythm at Malik's company, piecing together a life that felt both unfamiliar and quietly hopeful. Each day she learned something new: how to navigate the office, how to manage tasks without trembling under the weight of imagined judgment, how to breathe without hearing echoes of insults that once tore her world apart. The city still intimidated her, its pace relentless, but she found small moments of belonging, moments where she caught herself smiling without guilt, moments where she realized that she no longer flinched at every whisper around her. Malik's guidance had become an anchor she didn't fully understand yet. He treated her with a respect that reminded her she had value beyond her scars, and that simple recognition had begun to reshape her sense of self. She believed, almost timidly, that she was finally stepping into a chapter not defined by humiliation. But past wounds have long memories. She had no idea that miles away, in the village she had left behind, her ex-groom Osman was discovering the transformation she had undergone. Osman, once confident in his influence and proud of the way he had publicly discarded her, felt a sting of something he refused to name, something close to regret, but twisted quickly into jealousy. When he heard that Amina now worked for a respected and rapidly rising businessman in the city, his pride recoiled violently. In his mind, she had no right to rise after he had cast her aside. The idea that she could find dignity, belonging, or worse, admiration, gnawed at him like a shadow refusing to release its grip. Driven by resentment, Osman began whispering carefully crafted lies to people who still believed his word carried weight. He painted Amina as manipulative, claiming she had used emotional pity to trap a wealthy employer. He suggested she had run from the village to hide shameful secrets. The rumors spread with the same effortless speed that cruelty always seems to possess, slithering from one conversation to the next until they found their way into the city, carried by someone who thought gossip was harmless entertainment. Soon, subtle changes rippled through Malik's office. Odd looks, hushed conversations, and paused whispers that dissolved the moment Amina entered the room. Amina sensed the shift immediately. The familiarity she had slowly built began dissolving around her. Confusion wrapped itself around her chest like a tightening vine, squeezing old fears to the surface. She tried to focus on her work, to remind herself that she had earned her place through effort and endurance. But each sidelong glance reminded her of the wedding day she could never forget. The public shame, the accusations, the way people had believed lies without hesitation. She felt the past approaching again, cold and relentless, threatening to tear apart what she had barely begun to build. Her breath wavered, and the fragile confidence she had nurtured started to crumble under the weight of memories she thought she had left behind. Malik noticed before she spoke a single word. He saw the hesitation in her steps, the quiet tremble she tried to hide when she placed documents on his desk, the subtle way she avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Malik was not a man easily swayed by rumors, but he understood how reputations could be shattered by careless words. He began asking quiet questions, tracing the origin of the whispers with the meticulous precision of someone unwilling to let injustice walk freely. When he uncovered the source, the bitter envy of a man who wanted to destroy what he could not control, Malik felt a calm anger settle into his chest. It was not fury born of impulse, but a firm resolve shaped by his growing respect for Amina. He called a meeting, addressing the entire department with a clarity that cut through every hidden whisper. Without naming her directly, he condemned the spread of unfounded accusations within the company. He spoke with a conviction that allowed no room for doubt, stating that their workplace would not tolerate rumor or character assassination. Then, with unmistakable firmness, he confronted the individuals responsible for echoing Osman's lies, making it clear that their behavior would have consequences if repeated. The room fell silent, and Amina, standing near the back, felt a sense of protection she had never experienced, not from family, not from friends, not even from those who once claimed they loved her. For the first time in years, someone had defended her without hesitation. But Malik's actions carried a weight neither of them anticipated. His unwavering defense did more than silence the rumors. It revealed something deeper, something neither of them had fully acknowledged. When Amina met his eyes afterward, she saw something unspoken lingering there, a recognition of connection that extended far beyond employer and employee. It startled her, yet warmed something in her that had been cold far too long. And though neither dared voice it, the moment marked the beginning of a bond powerful enough to change both their lives, if only they survived what destiny was preparing to unravel next. Some connections do not announce themselves with grand gestures. They bloom quietly, threading their way through shared struggles and silent understanding, until one day they stand undeniable, powerful enough to shift the course of two separate lives. In the weeks following Malik's defense, an unspoken shift settled between him and Amina, subtle, delicate, yet unmistakably present. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something deeper in its early form, something that grew not from attraction, but from the kind of respect born between two souls who understood the weight of carrying wounds in silence. Amina found herself moving through the office with a steadier breath, no longer shrinking from whispers that once haunted her like echoes from the village. The certainty in Malik's voice the day he shut down the rumors lingered inside her, reminding her that dignity was not something granted by others. It was something reclaimed, piece by piece, by those who refused to let past humiliation define their worth. And Malik, though he said little, carried a softened awareness in his gaze whenever she entered the room, as if he had begun to see her, not just as an employee working to survive, but as a woman rebuilding her world with quiet, unshakable strength. Their days gradually developed a rhythm. Malik, who had once handled paperwork alone, began leaving certain tasks for Amina, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he trusted her judgment. He would ask for her perspective on projects that required sensitivity, and she responded with a clarity that surprised even herself. She noticed things others overlooked. She asked questions that revealed thoughtfulness rather than fear of being wrong. And though he rarely praised her outright, his small nods of approval carried the weight of a man who did not give respect lightly. Sitting across from him in the warm glow of late afternoon office light, she sometimes wondered how someone who carried so much authority could also carry such patience. Outside the office, the world continued to test her. Some employees still whispered, unsure of how someone like her, quiet, humble, trained by hardship rather than privilege, could earn Malik's attention. Others observed the subtle way Malik listened to her opinions and tried to mirror her work ethic, sensing she had become someone worth learning from. But Amina paid little attention to assumptions or envy. She had not come here for admiration. She worked because work gave her a place in the world, a place she had once feared she might never find after the collapse of her wedding day. Each completed task, each learned skill, became proof that she could rise beyond the boundaries others had drawn around her. Yet it was in their quiet moments that something unexpected began to take shape. Sometimes, after long meetings, Amina would catch Malik studying her, never inappropriately, never with entitlement, but with the thoughtful gaze of someone trying to understand a story he sensed was larger than the version she shared. And when their conversations drifted from work into small fragments of personal history, her mother's resilience, his father's lessons, the villages they once called home, they realized how much their experiences mirrored each other. Both had known struggle, both had risen by holding on to the last thread of dignity when everything else seemed determined to break them. Their bond was not built on romance, but on recognition, an acknowledgement of pain survived, burdens carried, and the human capacity to rebuild what had once been shattered. The office staff noticed, even if they didn't understand. They saw the ease with which Amina coordinated Malik's schedule, the near-instinctive way she anticipated his needs before he voiced them, the rare smile he allowed himself when speaking with her. To others, it looked like favoritism. To those paying closer attention, it looked like two quiet spirits learning to trust again. And trust, in environments shaped by ambition and ego, always draws attention, both good and dangerous. But what no one saw was what was unfolding inside Amina. She had not allowed herself to imagine connection since the humiliation that had torn her life apart. Malik's kindness unsettled her, not because she feared him, but because she feared herself, feared how easily her heart responded to the stillness he carried, the stability he represented. She had built internal walls to protect herself from pain, and without realizing it, Malik had begun dismantling them by simply treating her with the dignity she had long been denied. She didn't know what to call the quiet warmth that settled in her chest whenever he walked into the room, nor the sense of safety she felt simply by hearing his voice. But she sensed it, undeniably, growing between them like a fragile seedling, pushing through soil hardened by past storms. Malik tried to hide his own growing attachment, telling himself it was merely admiration for her discipline, nothing more. But each time she solved a problem he hadn't expected her to grasp, each time she spoke with a courage that contradicted her painful history, something inside him tightened, a recognition that this woman possessed a resilience he rarely saw, even among the most accomplished people in his world. He had always admired strength, but the kind Amina carried, quiet, steady, earned through suffering, commanded a deeper respect. Yet the world is rarely generous to bonds formed in silence. Jealous eyes watched from the shadows of the office, eyes that did not care about dignity or truth, only about the influence they feared losing. And jealousy, when wounded pride fuels it, has a way of slipping into the smallest cracks of a story, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What neither Amina nor Malik knew was that envy had already begun weaving a plan designed not just to separate them, but to destroy everything Amina had fought so desperately to rebuild. Enemies do not fear your weakness. They fear the strength you are becoming, and it is often in the quiet rise of your confidence that they strike with the most calculated cruelty. Amina had grown into her role with a quiet grace that took even her by surprise. The office had stopped feeling like a battlefield, and for the first time since arriving in the city, she moved through her days without the constant tremor of fear in her chest. Malik's trust had strengthened her, and the unspoken bond forming between them gave her a sense of belonging she had thought she would never feel again. But shadows do not recede so easily. They gather, silently, behind the brightest lights, waiting for the moment optimism loosens its guard. And in this office, built on ambition, rivalry, and pride, her rising presence felt like a threat to those who had once dismissed her as insignificant. It began with whispers, quiet and cunning, slipping between cubicles like poison carried on the wind. At first, Amina dismissed them as the usual murmurs of jealousy, the harmless frustrations of co-workers unused to seeing someone like her, someone without wealth, status, or connections, earn trust she had not begged for. But then the whispers grew sharper, more coordinated, circling her name like vultures sensing wounded prey. The first blow arrived the day she walked into Malik's office with a file she had spent the entire evening preparing. Inside the folder, she expected to see her neatly arranged reports, the proof of her dedication. Instead, she found altered numbers, missing pages, and recommendations she had never written. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. Before she could understand how deeply the trap was woven, accusations followed. Someone claimed to overhear her discussing confidential plans with an outsider. Another insisted she had deleted key correspondence from Malik's inbox. Screenshots appeared, fabricated messages forged with just enough truth to make the lie believable. And in the center of it all, her name pulsed like a wound freshly reopened. The humiliation she had left behind in her village suddenly loomed again, stretching its shadow over her new life with a force that made her legs tremble. Old fear clawed at her chest, whispering the same poisonous lines she thought she had escaped. You are not worthy. You are not trusted. You are easy to blame. For a moment, just one aching moment, she felt herself slipping back into that version of herself who had walked home in a torn wedding dress, carrying shame that did not belong to her. She stood in the center of the office, surrounded by judgmental eyes, unable to speak as the storm gathered around her. But this time, the world did not watch her break. Before the accusations could suffocate her completely, the door to Malik's office swung open with a force that silenced every whisper in the room. His expression hardened, not with anger at her, but with a controlled fury directed at the room itself. Without raising his voice, he asked a single question: who altered her documents? The weight in his tone made several employees flinch, and when no one answered, he ordered every workstation unlocked, every sent message audited, every digital trail traced. His sharp, commanding presence carved through the tension like a blade made of truth. What followed was a revelation that struck the office like an earthquake. The forged emails originated from a single device. The altered documents were edited under someone else's login. Every piece of evidence pointed toward a colleague whose envy had been festering in silence. Malik confronted him in front of the entire staff, not with shouting, but with a precision that made the truth undeniable. Each detail laid bare, each lie dismantled with the calm efficiency of a man who did not tolerate injustice. Amina stood frozen, not from fear now, but from disbelief. This time, someone stood between her and humiliation. Someone refused to let a lie smear her dignity. Malik turned to her after exposing the culprit, and though he said nothing aloud, the reassurance in his eyes was louder than any words he could offer. In that moment, she realized something profound. She was no longer the girl who faced the world alone. She had earned a defender, not through pity, but through the strength she carried, the honesty she lived by, and the resilience that made her impossible to break. But protection comes with consequences, and the office felt the shift instantly. Malik's unwavering stance sent ripples through the company, unsettling those who had taken his distance for indifference. And as employees watched him take Amina's side so fiercely, the lines between professional respect and something deeper became impossible to ignore. And before the day ended, Malik made a decision, one so bold, so unexpected, that it left the entire company breathless and wondering what Amina truly meant to him. Some promises are born not from romance, but from respect, crafted quietly in the mind long before the heart dares to speak them aloud. For days after the sabotage incident, the office carried an energy that felt unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves sensed a shift no one dared to name. Amina felt it too, though she tried to ignore the lingering glances, the softened voices, and the way certain employees now measured their words in her presence. She kept her focus on work, refusing to let the storm of attention unsettle her. But Malik watched her with a gaze that held more than professional concern. Something within him had settled during the chaos, an unspoken truth he could no longer avoid. He had stepped up to defend her, because it was right. But what lingered afterward was something deeper, a realization that had been growing in quiet corners of his mind for weeks. Amina sensed the distance between them narrowing, not through grand gestures, but through subtle moments. The way he paused to listen when she spoke, the way his eyes softened when she entered a room, the way he began trusting her with tasks that once belonged only to his inner circle. It was not affection in its loudest form, but something quieter, more profound, woven from respect and the silent recognition of shared wounds. Yet she refused to misinterpret it. She had learned the cost of hope too many times. She would not allow herself to believe illusions again. But Malik was far from subtle when a truth mattered to him, and the truth of what he felt now pressed at him with a certainty he could no longer push aside. One evening, as the office emptied and the sky outside dipped into a warm, quiet dusk, he asked Amina to stay back for a brief conversation. She agreed, assuming it concerned a new project. She did not expect the solemnity in his eyes, the way he closed the door gently behind them, or the silence that settled between them like a breath waiting to be released. He began not with romance, but with honesty, the kind that carries weight because it has been examined carefully. Malik spoke about the day they first met, the strength he had seen even beneath her exhaustion, the dignity that remained unbroken despite the ashes of her past. He spoke about watching her rise from humiliation with a resilience that humbled him, and how every injustice she faced had only made him more certain of the person she truly was. He spoke about the moment he realized he feared not losing her work, but losing her presence. Amina listened, stunned, her heart thudding with a confusion she couldn't name. She had imagined many futures for herself, ones filled with struggle, ones filled with rebuilding, but never this. When Malik finally reached into his pocket and revealed a ring, she felt the world blur around her. It wasn't extravagant or loud, but simple, beautiful, and chosen with a sincerity that radiated from the man offering it. He proposed without theatrics, without kneeling even, because he wanted no trace of spectacle, only truth. He told her he was not proposing to save her reputation, nor to rescue her from anything. He was proposing because he could not imagine a future where her strength didn't stand beside his, where her voice didn't challenge his thinking, where her presence didn't fill the quiet spaces of his life with meaning. He told her he would wait as long as she needed, even if she never chose him, because her comfort mattered more to him than any answer. Amina's breath trembled. Gratitude, disbelief, fear, and a fragile spark of hope tangled inside her at once. She thought of her wedding day, the laughter that turned cruel, the shame that carved itself into her memory, the eyes of strangers watching her pain as if it were entertainment. She had sworn never to stand in front of anyone again in vulnerability. And yet here she was, being offered not pity, not protection, but partnership. A future built not on humiliation, but on respect. Her voice struggled to form words. Malik noticed her trembling and gently told her she owed him no immediate answer. But something in Amina's heart shifted, a slow, steady lift of a burden she had carried for far too long. She didn't say yes, not verbally, not yet. But the way her eyes softened, the way her hand did not reject his, spoke louder than any words she could have formed through the weight of her emotions. Outside, the office word of Malik's proposal would soon spread like wildfire. But in that quiet room, it was simply two people choosing truth over fear, two lives rewriting themselves in ways neither had planned. Yet beyond those walls, the world that once mocked her was already preparing for a wedding, unlike the one they destroyed. And not everyone would be ready to accept the woman she had become. Redemption tastes sweetest when witnessed by those who once doubted you, especially when your rise unfolds in the very places they expected your ruin. The morning of Amina's second wedding broke with a quiet dignity that felt almost sacred, as if the sky itself had softened in reverence to the journey that brought her here. Gone were the trembling hands, the forced smiles, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would treat her gently. Today, her heart beat with a calm strength, shaped not by fantasy, but by the truth she had earned through fire. The soft hum of the bridal room felt different from the noise of her first ceremony. There were no rushing relatives, no critical whispers poking at her insecurities, no shadows of humiliation waiting to pounce. Instead, the room carried warmth, filled with the gentle murmur of stylists who respected her and the supportive presence of Malik's family, who treated her as a daughter long before she wore their name. As she dressed in a gown crafted with understated elegance, she saw a reflection she barely recognized, still the same woman in spirit, but no longer fragile, no longer pleading for acceptance she never needed. The gown flowed around her like a soft whisper of triumph, its intricate details catching the morning light with a glow that mirrored the resilience etched into her journey. Her face, once dimmed by shame, now carried a radiance that came not from makeup, but from the quiet certainty of being valued, deeply, honestly, unconditionally. Outside, the venue had transformed into a breathtaking canvas of color and celebration. Malik had insisted that the ceremony reflect both their cultures, vibrant African fabrics, soft modern touches, and a harmony of traditions that spoke to unity rather than spectacle. Guests filled the space, some with genuine joy, others with awe, and a few with the stunned silence of those who never imagined they would watch the girl they once dismissed rise higher than any of their expectations. The whispers were different now, not sharp, not cruel, but filled with admiration and disbelief. People leaned to one another, recounting fragments of the past, trying to reconcile the woman walking into her destiny with the girl they once believed would never recover. When the doors opened and Amina stepped forward, A hush swept through the crowd, like a wind carrying reverence. The aisle stretched before her, not as a path to validation, but as a testament to every step she had taken since the day humiliation nearly swallowed her whole. Each footfall felt like a quiet reclaiming of the dignity stripped from her in public. Her posture held grace, her eyes held pride, and her presence commanded respect without demanding it. She felt the weight of the moment, not as pressure, but as a victory she deserved to embrace. At the altar stood Malik, not as a savior, but as a man who had learned to value her strength before her beauty, her integrity before her story, her spirit before her pain. His expression held a gentle awe, the kind born not from possession, but from gratitude. He didn't look at her as someone completing him, but as someone choosing to walk beside him. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, every hardship they had faced, both alone and together, wove itself into a promise stronger than any vow written on paper. The ceremony unfolded with a dignified beauty that touched every heart present. There were blessings spoken with sincerity, vows exchanged with trembling honesty, and moments when even the most skeptical guests wiped away quiet tears. But for Amina, the most profound part wasn't the ritual or the applause, it was the peace settling deep within her, a peace she never imagined she would find after the ruin of her first wedding. Here, in this space, surrounded by people who now recognized her worth, she finally felt the closing of a chapter, long stained by pain. Yet among the sea of faces, one pair of eyes carried nothing but regret. Hidden toward the back, half shielded by the shadows, her ex-groom watched with a stiffness that betrayed the storm inside him. He had come secretly, drawn not by good intentions, but by the weight of curiosity, and the sting of watching the life he once mocked become a future he could never reclaim. His jaw tightened as he saw her smile freely, saw Malik look at her with reverence, saw the respect she now received effortlessly. The realization settled painfully in him. The girl he once humiliated had risen far beyond his reach. And as Amina and Malik sealed their vows, her ex-groom stepped further into the shadows, his presence unnoticed, but his intentions far from silent. True power lies not in wealth, but in the strength to rise without bitterness, turning wounds into wisdom, and pain into a path others can follow. Marriage did not change Amina's essence. It revealed the depth of a woman who had spent years stitching her dignity back together, one quiet act at a time. Standing beside Malik did not make her powerful. Rather, it gave her a platform to finally release the power she had carried in silence for so long. In the months following their wedding, she stepped into her new life not as a trophy wife to a billionaire, but as a woman determined to give purpose to her journey, to ensure her suffering did not end with her, but instead opened doors for others still trapped in the shadows she once lived in. Malik's foundation, originally created to support education and rural development, expanded with her presence. But instead of simply attaching her name to outside projects, she immersed herself in every detail, driven by a determination shaped by the very humiliation that once threatened to break her. Amina's first initiative was born from memory, a memory of standing alone in her torn wedding dress, judged by strangers who never knew her truth. She created a program specifically designed for abandoned brides, young women whose dreams had shattered under the weight of rejection. She listened to their stories with a tenderness that came from lived experience, offering not pity, but understanding, not charity, but opportunity. Her approach was unlike anything the foundation had attempted before. She didn't sit behind desks or send out teams in her name. She visited communities herself, sat on woven mats, held trembling hands, and brought an authenticity that no amount of wealth could replicate. Word of her work spread quickly. At first, people were intrigued by the idea of a billionaire's wife walking through villages with nothing but notebooks and compassion. But the intrigue soon shifted into admiration as they witnessed her humility, her ability to speak without condescension, and the quiet dignity she carried even in the most painful conversations. She remained deeply aware of her past, not as a source of shame, but as the compass guiding her purpose. And in every woman she helped, she saw a reflection of the girl she once was, the girl who walked home in broken silence after her first wedding collapsed. Within a year, her programs flourished beyond expectation. Abandoned brides were trained in crafts, business skills, technology, and financial literacy. Some started small enterprises. Others pursued education. Others found the strength to rebuild their lives in ways they once thought impossible. She became the living proof that broken beginnings could lead to powerful destinations, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that humiliation could be transformed into the very foundation of success. Her story, once whispered with scorn, was now shared with pride across communities, schools, and gatherings. She became a symbol of resilience, an embodiment of the belief that rising without bitterness was the purest form of triumph. Yet what made her influence extraordinary was not the public praise, but the private way she carried herself. Despite her new status, she never allowed wealth to build walls around her. She walked among people with the same softness she carried in her hardest days. She greeted strangers with warmth, listened more than she spoke, and treated every person, regardless of their status, with the respect she once desperately craved. Malik watched her with a growing awe, realizing that the woman he married was not simply surviving her past. She was rewriting the futures of countless others. His love for her deepened in the quiet spaces, watching her mentor young women, seeing her voice steady communities, and witnessing her transform small ideas into movements that touched thousands. Eventually, the media turned its attention to her, drawn by the unusual rise of a woman whose story no longer resembled the fragile one they might have once pitied. Interviews flooded in, invitations from global organizations arrived, and her influence reached international stages. But Amina approached every spotlight with caution, ensuring that her message remained centered on the women she served rather than on herself. She understood that visibility was not the goal. Impact was. Still, even as the world celebrated her rise, Amina never forgot the village she came from, or the shadows that once swallowed her confidence. She visited her old community quietly one afternoon, standing at the very spot where her first wedding had crumbled. Instead of pain, she felt a quiet gratitude settle in her chest. Gratitude not for the cruelty she endured, but for the journey that followed. The hurt no longer owned her, and the whispers that once scarred her had lost their power. She walked away from that place taller, knowing her destiny had never belonged there. Her voice, her compassion, her influence, they reached far beyond the boundaries of the life she once knew. And as her foundation grew internationally, invitations arrived from leaders and nations across the world, each calling her not a victim of her past, but a beacon of hope for their future. When a story born in pain reaches the world, it becomes more than survival. It becomes a force that reshapes destinies. Amina never expected her work to ripple far beyond her homeland. She had begun with a simple intention: to uplift women like the one she once was, fragile and standing at the edge of despair. But transformation has a way of spreading when it is sincere, and soon, what started as a small program for abandoned brides became a movement that crossed borders, languages, and cultures. Her story, once hidden beneath dust and ridicule, now traveled through international conferences, academic journals, and humanitarian reports. People spoke her name, not with pity or curiosity, but with a reverence usually reserved for pioneers who redefine what resilience looks like. It began when a global development summit invited her to share her experience. Malik encouraged her gently, reminding her that her voice now carried weight, crafted through lived truth. Amina stepped onto that stage with calm determination, her heart steady, despite the sea of influential faces watching her. She spoke not about her suffering, but about the strength that rose from it. She described the countless women she had met, each carrying stories more painful than hers, and the systems she was helping them build so their dignity could flourish independently. She spoke softly, yet every word struck with a clarity that commanded attention. By the time she finished, the hall resonated with silence, the kind that marks the presence of a message too honest to applaud immediately. From that moment, doors she never imagined, standing before, began to open. She was invited to partner with international organizations, to guide programs for women's rights, to advise on rural economic independence. But despite the prestige surrounding her, she remained profoundly grounded. Amina traveled between countries with the same composure she carried when walking through village markets. She visited refugee camps, remote schools, and community workshops with a humility that made people open their stories to her with trust. In each place, she advocated not for charity, but for dignity, not for temporary relief, but for sustainable empowerment. And everywhere she went, people listened, because she spoke from the scars she had healed, not from a script designed to impress. Her impact surprised even global leaders. She created cross-border mentorship platforms, introduced training structures, and encouraged partnerships between women who had once believed they lived in separate worlds. Her presence stitched together bonds between communities, reminding them that suffering was universal, but so was the strength to overcome. Malik watched her growth with pride that deepened with every milestone. He often accompanied her, not as a man trying to overshadow her spotlight, but as someone who understood that her voice now carried the power to inspire entire generations. Yet despite her expanding influence, Amina refused to detach from her origins. She returned frequently to the communities she served, walking through familiar dusty paths, greeting women she had supported, celebrating their progress, and listening to the new challenges they faced. She remembered the girl she once was, the girl whose life had nearly collapsed under the weight of public humiliation, and she protected that memory not with sorrow, but with a gentle respect. It kept her connected to her mission. It reminded her that the world she served still held too many women standing where she once stood, silent, afraid, and unseen. Her story soon reached classrooms, where young girls learned not just about her achievements, but about the power of endurance. It reached parliaments where lawmakers debated reforms inspired by her work. It reached social platforms where millions reposted fragments of her speeches, using her words as anchors for their own struggles. Her rise was no longer measured by the foundation's growth or the awards she received. It was measured by the lives unfolding differently because she existed. Yet as her influence expanded, so did the expectations surrounding her. Nations looked to her for solutions. Organizations sought her leadership, and her schedule brimmed with commitments meant to shape futures beyond her own. It was an overwhelming level of responsibility, one she handled with remarkable steadiness, but one that also carried a weight she rarely expressed aloud. Malik noticed the fatigue she hid in her eyes, the way she sometimes paused before speaking, gathering herself quietly. He knew the world saw her as unbreakable, but he understood the fragile threads beneath her strength. And just as her legacy reached its highest point, another unexpected opportunity emerged, one that would demand a new level of courage, forcing her to step into an arena larger than anything she had ever navigated. As global leaders prepared to offer her a role that could reshape policies across continents, Amina sensed that the next chapter of her life would test her resilience in ways even she had never imagined. Some destinies are not chosen. They rise from the ashes of the wounds meant to bury us, shaping us into voices the world cannot ignore. Amina stood at the edge of a new horizon, one she never imagined she would face. International leaders from across continents gathered for a summit designed to redefine policies around women's rights, economic development, and social inclusion. And at the heart of this global effort, they unanimously selected Amina to lead a new international council dedicated to empowering vulnerable women worldwide. It was an honor few received, a responsibility even fewer accepted, and a role that demanded not just intelligence, but moral clarity, the kind forged only through survival. As she prepared her response, she felt the weight of her past settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a crown shaped by every humiliation she had endured and transformed. She remembered the dusty street where she once stood with trembling hands, her wedding dress stained by a shame she hadn't deserved. She remembered the neighbors who whispered as she walked home, her confidence slipping through her fingers like sand. She remembered the journey to the city, the exhaustion in her bones, the fear in her breath. And she remembered Malik, the man who had recognized her strength when she had barely recognized it in herself. All those memories layered inside her, forming the foundation of the woman she had become. Now the world sought her leadership, not because she was wealthy or well-spoken, but because her truth held a power that transcended borders. When she stood before the council to deliver her acceptance speech, she did not begin with victory. She began with vulnerability, sharing the humiliation that once left her standing alone in a broken ceremony, and how that moment carved her future without her knowing it. She spoke of the women she had helped, the ones carrying wounds deeper than her own, the ones who reminded her every day that pain did not discriminate. She spoke of the foundation, the programs, the lives rebuilt through courage and community. But most importantly, she spoke of transformation, not as a miracle, but as a choice repeated daily by those who refuse to remain broken. Her voice wove through the auditorium with the quiet strength of someone who no longer needed to raise it to be heard. When she finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not for spectacle, but for sincerity. Powerful figures approached her afterward, offering handshakes and partnerships, but she remained grounded, knowing her mission was never about acclaim. It was about giving voice to the millions who still lived in silence. Over the following months, Amina traveled more than she ever had before. She sat in boardrooms with international ministers, stood in schools filled with girls whose dreams outgrew their circumstances, walked through refugee camps haunted by stories of loss, and met families whose daughters faced dangers she had only heard about in distant reports. Everywhere she went, people listened. They didn't listen because she held authority. They listened because she carried truth. Her leadership soon led to groundbreaking reforms. Countries began adopting her model for abandoned bride rehabilitation. Legislation was drafted to protect women from public humiliation tied to marriage practices. Global funding initiatives were created to support grassroots organizations led by survivors. Amina's impact became a living legacy, one that would outlast her by generations. And through all of it, Malik remained by her side, not as a figure overshadowing her achievements, but as her steadfast anchor, the quiet strength behind her strength. Yet despite the global acclaim, Amina remained deeply connected to her roots. She returned often to the village where her story began, walking through its familiar paths with a serenity that once felt impossible. She visited the young women she had trained, encouraged their businesses, celebrated their successes. The same neighbors who once whispered with scorn now spoke her name with admiration, pride, and shame for the roles they had played. But Amina held no bitterness toward them. She had outgrown resentment long ago. Forgiveness had become her quiet form of power. On the anniversary of her first failed wedding, she stood at the empty courtyard, where everything had fallen apart. This time, she wasn't trembling. She stood tall, dignified, surrounded by a small group of women she had helped lift from their own ruins. She spoke to them softly about rising, about dignity, about understanding that humiliation did not define identity. They listened to her as though listening to a prophecy. As the sun dipped low, painting gold across the earth, Amina felt something shift within her, a peaceful acceptance, a recognition that every step of her painful beginning had guided her toward a purpose far greater than a broken ceremony. Cliffhanger. And as she prepared to leave the courtyard for the final time, A messenger arrived with news that would open a new door, one that promised to change not just her destiny, but the destiny of millions she had yet to meet. If Amina's journey touched your heart, don't leave without becoming part of our story family. Subscribe now, because more powerful, life-changing stories are coming, and you deserve to hear every one. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice adds strength to every story we tell. And if this story inspired you, share it. Someone out there may need this reminder of hope and resilience.